Good evening and welcome back to Magic the Judging. I'm David Lyford-Smith and we're going to be talking a little bit today about triggers. In fact, we're going to be talking about anything and everything to do with triggered abilities, both in terms of the rules aspects of how to recognize them and what they are and how they work within the rules, and also and primarily talking about the recent changes to the Magic Infraction Procedure Guide, which tells us about how to deal with them. Before we get into that, though, I did want to just have a little bit of a debrief on some of the stuff that we talked about last week. So last week we were discussing some things to do with Return to Ravnica judging and also to do with judging pre-releases. And I asked for a challenge if anybody had managed to populate an additional Vraska Assassin token. Ben Heath tells me that some unnamed player at his pre-release, blessed with the good fortune of opening 2 copies of Vraska in his pre-release pool, did in fact manage to populate an assassin token. I don't know who they are, but congrats to them for that. We also, of course, were talking a little bit about how to make those events fun, and I think that tied nicely into a discussion that has been happening on the judge list recently with regards to the possibility of registering pools and checking pools, and of course also of possible cheating in pre-releases. So I just wanted to dedicate a couple of minutes to talking about the topic of rules enforcement at pre-releases. Pre-releases aren't the place for deck registration, and they are 100% certainly not the place for a deck swap. The point of a pre-release is to let your players get excited about opening and playing with the new cards, and it's not exciting to have to open the exciting new card that you have wanted to play with from the new set, only have to give it to someone else because there's a deck swap. I realise, of course, the chances of that player receiving something exciting are just the same, but it isn't the same emotional experience as opening it yourself as just being handed it in a deck swap. So I think there's a lot of feel bad to be had by running deck swaps, and I don't think they're the right way. Another option that people sometimes talk about is just registering the pool, but not the actual deck build, seeing as there's continuous construction. I think there's some value to be had for that, although, again, it does increase the amount of time between your players being able to open their boosters and play with them. An even simpler method yet is asking people to show their neighbours what the rares in their boosters were, which is not so much a method you could actually use to enforce something, although you may be able to do so. It's more of a way of discouraging cheaters by making them think that then they are being overseen, that other people do know things about what was in their pool, that there's something going on there. You could also do things like pool checks, make sure that people have the correct number of rares and uncommons in their pool, remembering, of course, that foils will not count towards the total of rares and uncommons that they might have opened. And all those things are possible to discourage cheaters. Of course, the main thing should be to cultivate a kind of culture of fair play and what have you within your players, to reward cheaters as little as possible by having a very flat prize structure. These are the kinds of things that you can do to try and encourage people to just play for fun, because that's what the pre-release is about. So that's everything I had to say about last week. So let's get on to talking about triggered abilities. We're going to start with a discussion of triggered abilities from a rules point of view, about what triggered abilities are, why they exist in the game, how we can recognize them, and so forth. So a triggered ability is essentially an ability of a card that happens when a certain event happens. A triggered ability is different from an activated ability, which is one which the controller can make happen whenever they wish by paying a cost, and different from a static ability, which will generally be active all the time that the card is in play. Triggered abilities do have a couple of different wrinkles, and of course, unlike many other types of abilities, there's no hard and fast rule. You can always recognize an activated ability, because an activated ability will always be a cost, a colon, and an effect. It's a very clear and easy way to recognize those things. But it's not the same to be said for triggered abilities. It's not as clear of a thing. That being said, there is one rule, which is that a triggered ability has to contain the word when, whenever, or at. And if that has at, it's almost always going to be at the beginning of your upkeep at the beginning of combat, at the end of combat, at the end of your turn. It's always marking a point in the turn when it happens. You will also have when and whenever, which are just used interchangeably based on what type of trigger we're looking at and whether it's expected to happen once or many times. So you can find a triggered ability on a card by searching for things like when, whenever, or at, and what it will do is it will specify either an event or a part of the turn, which is the trigger condition. A triggered ability then goes onto the stack, and triggered abilities, and this is something I think that sometimes isn't well understood by many people. Triggered ability goes onto the stack just like any other ability, and it's played just like any other ability. The difference is that there's no cost associated with it; it just automatically puts itself on the stack at the right time. But you still go through the same usual steps of casting an ability, activating an ability, except obviously not activating ability, but it's similar in terms of choosing targets, putting the ability on the stack, and then removing it if you aren't able to play it. So this is something, for example, if you have something that triggers which has no legal targets, for example, you might have a triggered ability that says when at the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If you have that trigger and it's at the beginning of your upkeep, the ability will go on the stack, but if there are no legal targets, it is then removed from the stack again, and the game proceeds without the trigger resolving. Triggered abilities do come in there are a couple of other wrinkles which I'm going to discuss here so that we can hook up with them later in policy. There is such a thing as a state-based trigger or state trigger. State triggers, unlike other types of triggers, trigger on a particular game state being true. For example, when you control 20 or more creatures would be a state trigger. These kinds of triggers are very unusual because, of course, once their condition becomes true, it tends to be that it continues to be true. For example, using my imaginary 20 creatures card, that card would trigger once I had 20 or more creatures, but I still have 20 or more creatures. This condition continues to be true whilst the ability is going on the stack. And the rules have a provision for this which stops it just triggering an infinite number of times and the game crashing effectively. Once an instance of that trigger is on the stack, others can't go on it. There's just one instance. It sits there. When it resolves, or when the trigger is removed from the stack otherwise, for example, by being countered by something like a void slime, if the condition is still true, then a new trigger will go on the stack, and it will continue going on the stack until there's a resolution which leaves the state trigger being untrue. There is a very small number of state triggers. I'm actually struggling to think of one, and the effect of the state trigger will almost always be something that will either end the game or will cause the original condition to no longer be true, which is why they can exist to trigger on a state and not just go infinite, which obviously would be a little bit awkward. So that's state triggers. The other and slightly more important class of triggers, and what we'll talk about today, is a delayed triggered ability. A delayed triggered ability is a triggered ability whose only effect is to create another triggered ability that will happen later on. Rather than beating around the bush, I'm going to go straight to the pertinent example here with Grave Betrayal. Grave Betrayal is a return to Ravnica rare which has a delayed triggered ability. It says that when a creature an opponent controls dies, at end of turn, you return that creature to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 as a black zombie in addition to its other types, etc. The two things there you might have noticed is that first of all it has that magical word when. When a creature an opponent controls dies, that indicates that there's a triggered ability there. After that condition, we then get into the second part of parsing that sentence, which tells us the effect. And the effect starts with the other magical word at the beginning of the next end step. So what we've got here is a pair of triggered abilities. One is created when a creature dies. All it does is create the second one, which then happens at end of turn and does something to the creature that died. Delayed triggered abilities are a little bit strange because the second one doesn't have a source, like a visible source. Most triggered abilities will have come from a card in play. Generally speaking, we're talking something on the battlefield specifically because triggered abilities generally are going to be on permanents. But But a delayed triggered ability doesn't have any representation in the game except for the fact that a previous triggered ability has to have resolved. And that's something that we're going to talk about when we get to the depths of the policy stuff. So, triggers. Well, that's an overview of the rules of triggers. They exist because sometimes the game needs to do things and it can't rely on the players doing it for them. Delayed triggered abilities exist so that things that need to have an effect every turn can be made to happen every upkeep usually, so that creatures that can get bigger automatically can do so. And if you look at very, very old cards, then the wording on some of these was sometimes not very clear. They almost looked a little bit like activated abilities, and the templating was very unclear, but now we have a very clear class, which is triggered abilities. So what's the problem with triggered abilities? Why is the policy such a bone of contention? Why is it changed so frequently? The problem with triggered abilities is that they are game actions which should happen at various intervals throughout a game of Magic the Gathering, but which are not necessarily directly initiated by either player. There is no cost being paid, there is no active conscious choice being used to make the ability happen, and they are also not continuous effects that will be present as long as the responsible card is present. This combination of two things means that they're very easy to forget. Everyone that plays Magic every so often forgets a triggered ability that was supposed to happen at a particular time, particularly triggered abilities that they're not really considering. So it's not unusual to forget these abilities. As of course, they are also invisible. There is no immediate thing. This isn't like Magic Online. When Magic Online, as soon as you fulfill a trigger condition, a new box pops up and the triggered ability appears in it and it asks to be put on the stack. There's a clear enforced action there that tells you that the trigger is there. And in real life Magic, that doesn't happen. So the problem with triggered abilities is that it's easy to forget them. The other problem with triggered abilities is that they are a huge part of what makes the game of Magic tick. I can tell you that there are over 4,000 cards have a triggered ability on them out of about 12,500 that exist, around a third. And of course, Magic, being a very deep and complex game, has a huge variety of strengths and weaknesses, and different triggered abilities can be hugely variant in what they do to the game. This means that crafting policy that consistently and fairly handles triggers is really, really hard. Some triggers are extremely beneficial for the controller, and we definitely want to be treated in one particular way, whereas other triggers will definitely be considered not beneficial to the controller, and in some cases are very much detrimental to the controller, and therefore we've got a problem. We also have issues that some triggered abilities might be controlled by one player, but require action from the other player, and there's a problem there as well. So let's talk a little bit about the history of policy of triggered abilities. The major history of triggered abilities as their own category starts around the time of Cold Snap, where the existence of Dark Confidant had made a particular triggered ability a very highlighted existence in Standard, as it was of course a highly played card, and then the addition of the Cold Snap set. The three mechanics, in case you weren't playing in Cold Snap, the three keyword mechanics in that set were Recover, Cumulative Upkeep, and Ripple, all three of which are triggered abilities, and therefore the current limited format had a lot of triggered abilities going on in it. Dark Confidant was seeing a lot of play in Standard, and triggered abilities generally were very much highlighted. And it was at that time that the first kind of separate policy for triggers, separately from the simple kind of game rule violation style general class, was kind of created and refined, and some thoughts were put into how to do things. A large linchpin of that old policy was talking about how to deal with optional triggers, triggers that contain you may do X. Because generally speaking, cards at the time were worded such that if an ability was considered to be upside, if it was considered to be a positive ability, they would generally make it so that the card said you may do X, so that if the player did not do the benefit, they had no one to blame them by themselves. The game didn't mandate that they did the positive thing, they had simply chosen not to use it. And that was a linchpin of policy at the time. Fast forward a few years to Innistrad. Around the time of Innistrad, the good folks at Wizards R&D had been looking at some of the rules text they felt wasn't pulling its weight on cards, And in particular, what they decided was that you may was something that they didn't want to put on as many cards anymore. They found that the text was confusing for newer players, that it made card text longer, and that it was ambiguous. So they decided that going forward, unless there was a genuine, interesting strategic choice associated with the trigger, they were going to make things generally positive or negative be a mandatory trigger and exclude the "you may" wording. This is a fairly easy decision for Wizards to make, but it does have some ramifications for us as judges. The existing policy, which relied heavily on the card wording to identify positive triggers for us, was no longer available as a resource to determine positivity or otherwise. So this leads us into the very first attempt to change trigger policy to reflect the ongoing situation with cards and how they were going to be worded from around Innistrad onwards. In the kind of September-December update around that time, and there was an attempt made at defining a new type of trigger policy, which we're not going to discuss in great depth, as unfortunately it was repealed shortly after release. However, the core concepts of that then did go into the much discussed lapsing ability version of the policy, which had reigned for about 6 months up till the September-October update that we've just had. The key idea of those updates was to discuss the responsibilities of either player. In particular, the non-controlling player for triggers was absolved of all responsibility for the triggers of their opponent, which means basically if I'm playing a game, my opponent forgets to do a trigger, I could completely ignore it if I wanted to. I was entitled to do that. I would not receive any kind of penalty. That was one of the key things, because one of the major objectives of this was to get rid of the feel bad of having to remind your opponent to kill you with their card. Shrine of Burning Rage was a popular example, having to remind your opponent every time they had an upkeep or cast a red spell, put more counters on that card so you can kill me sooner. You have to remind your opponent about it. And that was one of the things we wanted to take out, so that was a major change. The second part was to try basically to, in lieu of cards actually having "you may" on them, create a system of lapsing triggers that would allow us to identify triggers that would be treated similarly to how optional triggers abilities used to be treated, i.e. identify things which we consider to be beneficial, thus that we could make it so that if you missed one, it wouldn't matter in terms of you getting any kind of penalty, you would just miss it, and that would be considered detriment enough that you wouldn't need a warning as well. So lapsing triggers happened. Lapsing triggers was something that was unfortunately very complicated. I don't think that was probably going to come as a surprise to anybody. We let it run for about 6 months to get a feel for how it was going to work, if people were going to be able to get on top of it, and how we could improve it. And the feedback was that many of the core aims of the policy were in the right place, allowing triggers to become more of a skill element. You know, it's a skill to remember your triggers, and it's up to you to do it if you want to benefit from them, and not giving excessive warnings for missing positive or unimpactful triggers was also something that we liked. But the lapsing trigger policy was very lengthy, very complex, and it had ballooned in length. We then started looking at a new policy, and I say we because, in case you weren't aware, by the way, I was one of the judges that was on the kind of little subcommittee that we put together to discuss how we were going to fix this problem. We were looking at two different options. One of them was a refined, revised, improved lapsing triggers policy, essentially a small series of changes and updates to the existing policy. And the other one was a dramatic change to a much more streamlined but much more judgmental policy, which, if you want to avoid the spoilers, then look away now, but that's the one we went with. In the end, we decided that the difference in length and complexity was simply unsustainable. The new version of the lapsing triggers policy was longer than, for example, the two-headed giant FAQ. And two-headed giants in multiplayer formats are a pretty complicated issue that causes a lot of judges problems, and which, in fact, is enough of a topic that we're going to dedicate an entire episode of this stream to it. That's next Tuesday at 7 p.m. by the way. Reminder of that later. So it got to the point where the lapsing triggers thing was really just too long. We knew that we needed to cut it down, and we didn't want to lose any of the finesse and improvements in how we handled things. So that's how we came to the policy as it stands today. History lesson over. Now then, I'm going to get up a copy of the latest Magic Infraction Procedure Guide, which I've just got on my other screen over here, by the way. So what I'm going to be doing is discussing a few of the key elements of this new policy, how it works, and what it means, and what you need to think about when you're a judge at a competitive event. So let's get started with the stuff that is much the same. Gameplay error miss trigger continues to be its own category of infraction, and it is now actually right up at the top, 2.1 of the gameplay error kind of section. It is still the policy that if you are going to get a penalty for mistrigger, that is going to be a warning. Of course, what we have done is made it so that you will get warnings for less things. Moving on, there's a little discussion about what it means to miss a trigger. I'm going to start with this one because this is, I think, the first important concept to get across. What does it mean to actually have missed a trigger? When am I considered to have missed a trigger? This is slightly different depending on who's the active player is and who's controlling the trigger. I'm going to talk about the primary case first, which is triggers that happen during my turn. Assuming that I'm the active player and I have triggered abilities on my cards, when am I considered to have missed them? It's when I've done something that should have happened afterwards. I'll give you an example. If I have a trigger that's supposed to happen at the beginning of my upkeep and I draw a card, the indication is that I have forgotten my upkeep trigger. I have now missed that trigger. Similarly, if I have an ability that triggers whenever I cast a red spell, I cast a red spell, I don't do anything to resolve the trigger, and then I move to combat or cast another spell. When I do that second part, then the indication is now I've missed the trigger. Up till that point, there's no clear evidence that I've missed the trigger. It's possible that I'm still thinking about it. So it's not simply that you have to have done something straight away. It's more when you have done something afterwards. That's what it means to have missed a trigger. So that's triggers and how you might miss one. Let's now also talk a little bit about what happens in your opponent's turn. If I have a trigger that's supposed to happen in my opponent's upkeep, I am not considered to have missed that when my opponent draws a card. The reason for that is that my opponent might be playing quite quickly and might draw that card before I get a chance to say anything. So instead the condition is a little bit different. In fact, one is, in the case of a trigger, I'm quoting here, controlled by the non-active player, after that non-active player has taken an action that indicates that they have actively passed priority. So what this means is I've allowed the game to progress. If, for example, my opponent says, go to combat, and I say, sure, I'm explicitly at a point now where I'm passing priority, I clearly have forgotten about whatever triggered abilities might have happened earlier. The general rule is that players can't try to play quickly or skip through steps in order to make their opponent miss triggers that should be happening in those steps. That's not something that's going to work. If your opponent has an upkeep trigger, you can't just play quickly on the hope that it won't work, that they'll forget about it. If they forget about it, that's up to them, but you can't just make your turn happen so quickly that they don't get a chance to stop you in your upkeep. So that's what missing a trigger is all about. Let's move on from missing triggers to a little bit about the first kind of talking about fixing these things. The major change in this version of the policy is that we have separated, for the first time in the MIPG or its predecessors, two different things. We've separated the awarding of a penalty or otherwise with the fix. Those are separate concepts now. How you fix the problem of a triggered ability that has been missed is separate from whether or not you are going to issue a warning. We've also indicated a difference to how judges can get involved in a mistrigger situation. Of course, if one of the players calls you to be involved in the game, you are going to get involved and you're going to apply policy. But if you're just spectating and you happen to notice a triggered ability that the players have not, you're not going to get involved as a default. You're just going to watch and let the game continue. The exception here is when you believe that perhaps there's some cheating involved. Of course, if you think there is a potential for some cheating or otherwise something else that would require an investigation, you can and must and should get involved in the situation. The second, much more common one, is that if you are intending to issue a warning for mistrigger, again, then you will stop at the game and get involved in it. Once you're sure that the trigger has been missed, i.e. the game has definitely progressed past the point when the trigger should have happened. At that point, you will step in to issue your warning. So, when do you issue a warning? I will again give you the definition here. We're going to come back to this as this is a pretty meaty topic, but the definition is the controller of the missed trigger only receives a warning if the triggered ability is generally considered detrimental for the controlling player. The current game state is not a factor in determining this. Well, there you have it. If the trigger is generally considered detrimental and you miss it, you're going to get a warning. If it is not generally considered detrimental and you miss it, you will not receive a warning. We're going to talk a lot more about that detrimental decision and how to make it and some guidelines for that. But I just want to go through the rest of the policy and then we'll come back to that really meaty topic. But I'll give you a clear example for this. And a trigger that is definitely generally considered detrimental, for example, would be a trigger that causes you to discard a card and nothing else, or lose life and nothing else, etc. If you have one of those triggers that is definitely detrimental and you don't remember to do it, then you are going to receive a warning. Well, what actually happens to the trigger, though, is a slightly separate issue. So let's look at the second half of this. The second half of the new policy is talking about the fix for the situation. This is different from whether or not you're issuing a warning. And I just want to emphasize that again because it is by far the most key and crucial change here. The warning is one thing. The separate thing is the remedy. First of all, there are a couple of easy cases which we can just blitz through real quick. If the trigger had a default action associated with it, and by this I almost all exclusively mean something that says at the beginning of your upkeep you may pay cost, and if you don't, sacrifice this. The default action there is sacrificing it. If it was that kind of trigger that was missed, you simply resolve the default action, in this case sacrificing it, straight away. What this means is if you've got something which is supposed to be sacrificed at the beginning of your upkeep, unless you pay some mana, you didn't pay the mana, then the fix is very simple. Once you simply are going to put the card in the graveyard, you're going to sacrifice it immediately. As I said, things with default action as a whole, I think, are entirely detrimental things. They are, as far as I'm aware, all of them are sacrifice this or do something bad unless you pay a cost. Therefore, a judge will get involved to issue a warning in these cases as well. So, for example, if you see somebody with their Wild Leotor who untaps and draws a card and has not paid green, you're going to stop the game, step in to issue a warning, and resolve the default action of putting the Wild Leotor in the graveyard. Now let's talk about another simpler one. This is one if the duration has already expired. What this usually means is, for example, triggers which create pump effects that might pump a creature until end of turn. If the turn in which the pump should have happened has already expired, then you just ask the players to continue playing. If, for example, you're looking at an ability and with a longer duration, detaining is a good example. You have to consider has the duration of that detain expired, i.e. from the point where the detain triggered ability should have resolved, which considering I believe the only card that is likely to have done this, it might be a martial law or one of the come into play creatures. You have to think, would the detain have worn off otherwise? If the detain would have worn off by now, you just ignore it and just the game continues without any further interaction from the judge. My first clarification here, when we're talking about durations, one of the things that we intend to talk about is the trigger of Geist of St. Traft. I realise that isn't explicit in the policy, but I just want to pass on that this is very much what we intend. Geist of St. Traft has an ability that creates a 4/4 angel token, puts it onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, exiles it at end of combat. If that trigger is forgotten and it's already after the end of combat, this is the fix you should be using. Just the game just continues. What you should certainly not be doing is putting the angel onto the battlefield tapped and attacking in the post-combat main phase. Hopefully that's a sensible conclusion that isn't going to surprise anybody, but that is what that wording is meant to indicate. Right, so that's those two little kind of optional sort of smaller cases dealt with. Let's deal with the beefy, the main thing that's going to happen. If you are involved in a trigger situation and it doesn't fall into one of those two categories, what is the fix? The fix is you ask the opponent. The opponent has the choice of whether they want the triggered ability to go on the stack or not. If it does go on the stack, it goes on the stack at the bottom, or if it should have triggered whilst during the current series of plays, and there are some other things on the stack already, you might have to insert it at its appropriate place. But 99% of the time, it's going to go on the bottom of the stack. In fact, a lot of the time, it's going to go onto the stack on its own. When it's get put onto the stack, also the controller can't choose something that what wouldn't have been a legal target at the original time of triggering. So, for example, using martial law again, which has at the beginning of your upkeep detain target creature an opponent controls. If that's forgotten and caught later, then if the opponent for some reason does want that to go on the stack, they can't choose to detain something that wasn't on the battlefield during the upkeep when the ability should have happened originally. Obviously, in that case, the majority of the time, the opponent's going to choose for it not to go on the stack because they don't want their stuff detained. But this is magic. You can always invent a situation where you might want that to happen. So those are the two arms of the policy. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the interaction of them. What we've got is a whole wide world of triggers, which I'm going to represent here using my hands. You go all the way from this end of things, which are very clearly beneficial to the owner. My favorite example here is Battle of Wits. Battle of Wits has a trigger that makes you win the game. That is the most beneficial possible triggered ability. At the other end, you have things which make you lose the game. These are definitely, absolutely, clearly detrimental to the controlling player. Coming in from the sides a little bit, we get into a point where in the middle, we have this whole big grey area of triggers where it isn't clear if they are beneficial or detrimental. And so this is what I want to emphasize here. The existing policy says warnings for things which are clearly detrimental, no warnings for everything else. So that's no warnings for anything in the grey area, and certainly no warnings for anything that's definitely beneficial. This is a kind of shift of how we treat that grey area to how we treated it under the lapsing triggers, and it's really important that you understand it. And now I'm going to talk about the interaction with the second part, which is that the fix allows the opponent to choose. The intention of this is this. First of all, we'll consider clearly detrimental triggers. You will get a warning for missing a clearly detrimental trigger. Secondly, your opponent is going to have the choice of whether to put it on the stack. And given that it's clearly detrimental, they are almost certainly going to choose to do that. Result, you will end up with a bad trigger happening, and you will also receive a warning. Don't miss your detrimental triggers. They're important. They're what makes the balances out your cards. Moving quickly over to the other end of the spectrum, we're going to talk about things which are clearly beneficial. If you miss something that's clearly beneficial, the judge isn't going to issue you a warning. If the judge is involved because one of the players called them to become involved, the opponent is going to have the choice of whether or not this ability goes on the stack. And that choice is almost always going to be that it is not going to go on the stack, because again, your opponent doesn't want you to do things which are clearly beneficial for you. The middle ground. These are triggers which have either an effect which may or may not be beneficial based on the current game state. For example, Armored Scarb puts the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. Whether or not you have your current library size and your opponent's strategy will affect whether that's beneficial or not. Or they might be things which have 2 elements to them, a positive element and a negative element. For example, Dark Confidant makes you lose life, but it also puts a card in your hand. It is not clearly detrimental or clearly beneficial. It's not detrimental as a whole, which is why people play Dark Confidant and why he's worth a lot of money, but it is situational. In this bracket, again, the judge is not going to actively get involved. You won't receive a warning for missing one of these triggers, but it will go on the stack or not based on whether your opponent thinks it is beneficial or detrimental to their game plan. If you're on 1 life and you forget a Dark Confidant trigger, your opponent may well choose to have it go on the stack and resolve. If you're on 25 life and miss a Dark Confidant trigger, your opponent is probably going to choose for it not to go on the stack and resolve. So what we're looking at is from this end, the really beneficial end, you're never going to get that effect, never going to get that effect, never going to get it, not going to get a warning either, just going to miss it. Into the middle where sometimes you will have to do the effect when your opponent decides that they want it to happen, and then into the clear detriments where your opponent is always going to choose for you to have it happen, and you're going to get a warning as well. That's the new setup. That is an overview of what the new triggered abilities policy is all about. So let's talk finally about the big topic here, which is this innocuous little phrase, is generally considered detrimental for the controller. This is obviously a very open-ended phrase. It is a phrase that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And that's how we want it to be to some extent, because we want to be able to utilize the judgment of the people viewing. We want to make it so that judges can use their judgment to make this decision. That being said, there are a couple of guidelines which will help you out. First of all, you will notice, if you look closely at this policy, there is no explicit treatment for optional triggers. And the reason is this. An optional trigger, by definition, cannot be detrimental. An optional trigger has an effect which, if it is positive, the controller will use it, and if it is negative, they won't. That means that it by definition, can never be detrimental for the controller. Therefore, you cannot get a warning for missing an optional trigger under this policy. That's the first important thing to think about. The second thing is, if you're not sure about something which is whether it is detrimental or not, you should be defaulting to the situation of it's not clearly detrimental. Your default position is don't give a warning and therefore don't step into and stop a game. What you're basically relying on there is the opponent. Excuse me. You're relying on the opponent. If the opponent thinks that that trigger is bad for their opponent, for the player, they're going to call you in and make that trigger go onto the stack because they want it to happen. But because it isn't clearly detrimental, you're not also going to give the player a warning. Another little guideline about when you're thinking about whether a trigger is detrimental or not is, is there a card that just does the trigger? So, for example, Dark Confidant is much discussed. So the core set enchantment Dark Tutelage is an enchantment which has the same exact triggered ability as Dark Confidant, and that's all it does. If there's a card that just does the thing you're talking about, then that is a very good indication that the ability is not detrimental, because the card exists, therefore that is implying that somebody might want to play a card that just does that. No card in Magic is intended to be negative in every circumstance. Therefore, if you've got something that just does that, then you're looking at something which is not clearly detrimental. So, let's talk about some corner cases and some detriments and so forth. If you are following this policy closely, you will know that Toby Elliott posted a DVD commentary on the policy, going into more depth and discussing how he views it. He's actually also posted a quick check of RTR, which you can find on the same blog as that DVD commentary, where he lists the clearly detrimental triggers that exist in Return to Ravnica. By his count, there are 8. That's really not very many, and most of them are very, very clear. An example is Transguild Promenade. Transguild Promenade makes you sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield unless you pay 1. That is very clearly a detrimental trigger because it will make you sacrifice your lands. It also will trigger with a default action. Therefore, we're talking about something that very much has a detrimental trigger. Another example he's given is Azor's Elocutors. Azor's Elocutors, the blue-white hybrid rare, actually has 2 triggered abilities, one of which is detrimental and one of which is one of which is not clearly detrimental. The one which puts counters and might make you win the game if you have enough of them, I hope we are all comfortable in saying is not clearly a detrimental trigger. The second ability is one that removes filibuster counters. Love filibuster counters, by the way. I won 3 games at the pre-release with them. They're great. The one that removes filibuster counters, taken in the context of Azor's Elocutors, is clearly detrimental, as you want those counters because they might make you win. Therefore, that is another ability which is clearly detrimental, and you will get warnings for missing it. Some slightly more interesting examples. First of all, actually, something like Detention Sphere. Detention Sphere is a reared up Oblivion Ring. It's a slightly more complex Oblivion Ring. Of course, the trigger that takes your known or non-land permanence away is considered not to be a detriment. That's why you're playing the card pool. That's why the card exists. The trigger that gives the things back when the card leaves the battlefield, that one is clearly detrimental. Yes, there are cases where you might Detention Sphere your own permanence and then return your own permanence, but that is very, very unusual, and it is not the kind of thing that is going to come up anywhere near often enough for us to want to write a line in policy about it. A couple other discussions. Volatile Rig. Volatile Rig has a few different triggered abilities. It has one which causes you to flip a coin when it's dealt damage and will occasionally sacrifice it. That one is clearly detrimental because the outcome is either nothing or you sacrificing your creature. It then has a further one when it dies, which again causes you to flip a coin and deals 4 damage to each creature, if again based on the result. That one isn't clearly detrimental because it is not clear, based on the game state. It may or may not be beneficial, and as we discussed earlier, we don't look at the game state. Purely in the context of Volatile Rig, that triggered ability could go either way. So that's the distinction there. The full list, the ones I haven't talked about, Worldspine Worm, his ability that shuffles him back into the library, is intended as an anti-reanimation clause, and it's Toby's feeling that that is meant to be interpreted as clearly detrimental. I'm not sure I agree with him on that one. I could kind of go either way, but again, I don't feel that it's likely to be something that comes up all that often, so I think there's a good discussion to be had there. Fairy Imposter sacrifices itself unless you return another creature. Very clear detriment there. Desecration Demon. Slight little wrinkle here. Basically, this card gets bigger if your and taps if your opponent sacrifices a creature. Whilst it does sometimes lead to the creature getting bigger, it only does so when your opponent chooses for it to happen. Because you're giving the opponent a choice here, this is a detrimental trigger. It is in that the card is a 4-mana 6/6, and it has the trigger to excuse the mana cost. It is very much intended as a detriment. The last one we've listed is Angel of Serenity. Angel of Serenity is a little bit weird because it can exile creatures as well as creature cards from graveyards, and depending on what exactly it is that you've exiled, whether or not the returning trigger is beneficial, well, is detrimental or not, might be a little bit unclear. I think, looking at the card as a whole, the most likely thing is that you're talking about the angel having exiled opponent's creatures, and therefore the trigger when the angel leaves the battlefield is going to be considered detrimental. I think that's fair as a default assumption. Sure, if they're using it as a sort of delayed triple raise dead, that might lead to occasional extra warnings here and there, but in the big picture, I don't think that's something we're worried about. As a kind of final discussion topic then, I wanted to talk about a particular example that is the current topic of Knowledge Pool. So this is the scenario of this week's Knowledge Pool. Andy and Neil are playing at a standard Grand Prix trial, so competitive Royale event. Remember guys, this is Comprel only. Comprel Plus only. Neil controls a phantasmal image that is currently a copy of Sun Titan and does not control any other creatures. Andy passes his turn, and in the end of turn step, Neil casts a Restoration Angel. Neil untaps, draws, casts a Delver of Secrets, and after it resolves, they then realise that the Restoration Angel's trigger ability was missed. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to run that through step by step, the policy. First of all, was the trigger missed according to the official definition? Yes. The Both players have clearly passed priority and preceded the game after that trigger should have happened, untapping, drawing, letting that Delver of Secrets resolve. It was definitely missed. Secondly, was it something with a duration that has expired? No, Restoration Angel does not have any kind of period that it applies to, so that is also not true. It's also not something with a default action. Is the ability of Restoration Angel clearly detrimental? Well, as it happens, it is an optional ability. It's a you may ability. Therefore, as I mentioned earlier, by definition, it cannot be considered to be clearly detrimental. So it is a situation. There's no need for a warning here. So what we're left with is the fixed part of it. And the fixed part is very simply looking at asking the opponent, do you want that Restoration Angel trigger to go on the stack or not? In this particular case, they are going to choose to have it go on the stack, and here's why. Now that it's going onto the stack, the controller of it, Neil, has to choose a target for it. It targets a non-angel creature, so Restoration Angel is clearly not an option. But a second important interaction is also that the Delver of Secrets was not on the battlefield at the time the trigger should have happened during Andy's end step. What this means is he also cannot choose to target Delver of Secrets with the trigger. He has to target something. As I mentioned, the ability is being played, he has to choose a target, and the only legal target is his Sun Titan Phantasmal Image. He targets his Sun Titan, which causes the Phantasmal Image ability to sacrifice to trigger in turn, and there's nothing he can do now. Whether or not he chooses to use the Restoration Angel ability is irrelevant, because by the time it resolves, the Sun Titan has already been sacrificed. So what we've got here is effectively a corner case, admittedly one that was quite popular in Standard for a while, but a corner case where despite a very clear positive trigger on Restoration Angel, it's detrimental to the player in this particular situation. The policy makes no account of things which are situationally detrimental, but because we have the power to give that decision to the opponent, to Andy, he has the power to make that Sun Titan get sacrificed anyway. There's not going to be a warning as well, but I don't think overall he's probably not going to be too dissatisfied with the outcome there. So we're running at about the 45-minute mark. I just want to discuss, completely off the top of my head, some of the things that have been happening in the chat. So I can see here that Tom Sikaitis raised the Shah of Nar Isle as something that he thought was an optional detrimental trigger. I have no idea what that card does off the top of my head. Well, I have a vague idea, but I'm going to look it up on Gatherer. You'll notice how I'm being a good judge here and not just answering it based on what I think it does. So let's have a look on Gatherer. Shah of Nar Isle is a future sight rare. It's 4 mana, 6/6 trample. Now there's probably going to be a detrimental trigger on here somewhere from that point. It has Echo 0. Just a real quick point on Echo 0 actually while we're here. I'll remind you that in the player communication guidelines, costs of 0 are assumed to be paid automatically. If I get untap and draw a card with something with Echo 0 or with a thick-skinned goblin in play, I haven't missed my triggered ability. It's just assumed. I see Tom's now backing out of his original claim. When Shah of Nar Isle's Echo cost is paid, each opponent may draw up to 3 cards. So there's an optional trigger here, but it's an option for my opponent. So it's a little bit peculiar. Basically, I have a trigger that gives a choice to my opponent. It's not an optional trigger for me, and so it's not really the kind of thing I was talking about. That trigger, as it happens, is detrimental for the Shah of Nar Isle's controller. And as I said, we don't. If it hasn't been explicitly discussed, the opponent has the option to put the trigger on the stack, and then when it resolves, we'll then have the option to draw 3 cards. Unlike an old policy where we would assume that the opponent chose not to draw 3 cards, in this one we will definitely give them that chance to draw 3 cards. So next time you're playing Shah of Nar Isle in a competitive REL event, please do tell me about it and tell me why. So that's a little bit of talk there. I also want to talk about something else that has changed. I haven't explicitly discussed it yet, but a change from old policy. We used to have this category of triggers with no visual effect. That is triggers such as Exalted, which didn't require a choice from a player, had no visual effect on the game, and those used to be assumed to happen automatically. We haven't discussed it because it's no longer true. Those triggers no longer exist. And I can tell you, had we gone with the revived lapsing idea, which we had also been entertaining, they wouldn't have existed there either. They are gone. If you want your triggers to happen, you have to acknowledge them. I should say acknowledge them, not announce them. You're not required to, like the Magic Online chat log, verbally repeat every trigger that you have. That is not an expectation we put on you. You have to acknowledge them. So, for example, for a life gain trigger, writing down a change in life total would be fine. A trigger that makes a token, putting a token, or reaching for your box of tokens is fine. For something like Geist of Saint Traft, saying swing with Geist, you take 6 is fine. You're clearly acknowledging, you're aware of the trigger's existence, you've demonstrated that you're changing the game in the way that the trigger indicates, and that is all we require from you. We don't require you to be a comprehensive rules bot that spits out exact descriptions every time. So, that is, in just over 50 minutes, a comprehensive look at everything there is to talk about at present with triggered abilities. So last week I gave you a little bit of a homework about seeing if you could find somebody that managed to populate an assassin. I want to kind of continue that and try and set that up as a little bit of a tradition if I can. So your task, your challenge, your homework assignment for this episode is as follows. Try to come up with a default action trigger that is not something, which is basically where the default action is beneficial. So, for example, we're looking at something which has a default action that you might want to do. I don't think there are any, but have a look. So, have a look at those. Tom raises the point that somebody did on Twitter. Yes, Ben Heath tweeted me and told me that somebody did, in fact, populate an assassin token. I actually also want to leave you with another message which has nothing to do with judging, and I hope you'll indulge me, but to do with something that's very near and dear to my heart. Tomorrow night, Friday night, on the 5th of October, I'm going to be taking part in a fundraising event called Bite Night. This is a fundraising event for Action for Children, which is a charity that works against the causes of youth homelessness. It's a cause that I think is very deserving, and what I'm going to be doing for this, God help me, is a rough sleep for the night. We're going to be sleeping outside under the stars with very little protection in Forbury Gardens in central Reading. We will have very little protection from the elements, and if you've been outside lately, then you will know the elements are currently wet and cold in the UK. And we're looking to get some funds together. And what I'd really like anybody watching this to do is consider if they would be able to spare anything for it. And if you would, then the way to do that is to go to virginmoneygiving.com, to search for David Lyford Smith on there as a fundraiser, and you can see there is one called BDO Reading. BDO is the company I work for, and I'm doing this through work, and there you can donate funds. As an added incentive, I should let you know that BDO, as my employer, have a policy whereby they will match pound for pound everything I raise. Plus, there is a possibility there'll be gift aid as well, so your donation could be more than doubled by the time it gets to the charity, which is obviously excellent and would be amazing if you could. So something to think about tomorrow. Tomorrow evening, when you're safe at home and tucked up in bed, that I will unfortunately be attempting to get to sleep in a sleeping bag in a park instead. That's all I had to say on that one. Just also to advertise something about scheduling. The intention here is that our regular time slot now is going to be Thursdays at 7, like it was today, and that's what we're going to try to stick to every week. I'm not going to do it next week, though, because unfortunately I'm going to the United States for, well, I say unfortunately, I'm going to the US to play in Grand Prix San Jose. That is a Team Trio Sealed Deck Grand Prix. I'm amazingly excited about it, but I am going to be there on the regular time slot of Thursday at 7 p.m, and therefore I'm not going to be able to do it. That means next week's episode is going to be Tuesday, so that is Tuesday the 9th of October, at 7 p.m. British Summer Time, and the discussion point will then be team events, running them, judging them, and indeed playing in them, as it's going to be something very much on my mind. Then the following week, i.e. 2 weeks from today, i.e. the 18th of October, we'll be back in our regular slot of Thursdays at 7 p.m. So a little bit of a scheduling thing for you there. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, comments, suggestions for topics, or anything else at all, do hit me up. We've got @MagicTheJudging Twitter account, run very generously by Gareth Tanner, my producer. And we also have my own personal account, which is @SaviaWanderer, SaviaWanderer. If you hit us up on those to let us know what is going on with you, if you've got any ideas or suggestions, we'd be very happy to hear them. That's all I've got to say. Thanks very much for tuning into this week's episode of Magic the Judging, and I will see you next Tuesday for team events.